What I'd like to talk about is primarily 18th, 19th, 20th, early 20th century woodworking or furniture making, and how molding planes were instrumental in creating all the fine furniture in those period of 250 years until, of course, machinery came around, routers and that sort of thing. And I'm Norman Perillo, a furniture designer, maker at Perillo Design, and woodworking educator, author at Wood Skills. And it sort of did away with hand tool woodworking at that time. So I've been delving into specifically molding planes, different styles or different types of molding planes, from simple to complex. The complex would create the complete profile in one pass or multiple passes, like an OG, for example. So I've dialed it back, and I've begun to work with more simple molding planes, specifically round planes, rabbet planes, that sort of thing, to create more basic molding profiles that were used in that period of 250 years. So these basic molding profiles they can be actually used on their own, or they can be combined. And I have an upcoming three-part series, and I'll be discussing one profile per episode, or per video in the series. And the first one would be, for example, a cove molding. The second would be an ovalo or a half round type molding. And the third would combine both the cove and the half round or ovalo into an OG, either a regular OG or a reverse OG. Haven't decided that yet. And this is an example of, I'll do some more detailed scenes, but this is an example of a cove. And this is an example of an ovalo or a round on the same board. And of course, grain orientation is instrumental in getting that right. And I'll discuss all that. I'll actually lay out everything. So I'll start with the cove molding. And ultimately, in the third part, we'll progress to this is actually two separate moldings. They're both OGs. One is, they're both standard OGs, and this has a reverse OG on this side. So this is it's just basically flipped around. So the cove is at the top and the round or ovalo is at the bottom, whereas this one has the ovalo at the top and the round at the bottom. So that's a little more advanced. Now each of these profiles has a fillet on the top and the bottom. So I'll demonstrate how to create how to determine the fillet and how to set it up, and all the layouts. So when you're creating this type of molding or profiles, layout is extremely important. I didn't even understand how important it was until I got into it, or I delved into it, and that's when I began to appreciate how important layout lines are, and creating the individual layout lines using a marking gauge that I'll demonstrate. You don't necessarily have to use this one, but this one works for me. It's a disc version. So this is the board I'll be using initially for the first two moldings, if they work out. And then ultimately a different board, and I'll be creating either a standard OG with the round at the top and the cove at the bottom with two fillets, or a reverse OG, I'm not sure. So let's get into the type of tools. I don't have a large selection of rounds and hollows, which I'll be using primarily to create, so the round plane would create a cove, for example. It's a round, so it creates the inverse of what the profile is on the plane. And the hollow instead creates, notice it's hollow, so that creates the round on the profile. So I'll be using, I have only two hollows at this point that are a fairly common size. I have larger versions, but they're primarily oriented towards architectural type moldings, large scale moldings, which I don't deal with at all. And I've actually restored these planes. I have a series of maybe 25 of these now. So I restored these, and and sharpened them and learned how to sharpen the blades, the profiles, and all that. So I've been successful with that after some experimenting. And this is one of two rounds that I have. The other one is fairly small, so it's used mostly for creating a beading, for example. And this is the only one I really have to work with these profiles at the moment, but I'm trying to source some more of these in the future. And this is a rabbet plane that I could be using, but I'm going to be using to delineate the individual fillets and all the layouts. I'm going to be using, I've come to prefer using a modern metal shoulder plane, and I can explain why, and also a Stanley rabbet plane with a moving fence, just to hog out material quickly. And I'll explain why. I could use a conventional rabbet plane, but they're not boxed. And what boxing is reinforcing of a corner or a high wear area of a hand plane. You don't normally see it on hollows and rounds, but you'll see it on beading planes and that sort of thing. So it doesn't have a boxed edge. Using this will wear out the edge considerably. So I've decided not to use the wooden one and use a metal one, primarily just to lay out the lines for the individual profiles. Now, in the process, I've had to also create it's called a sticking board, and this is the sticking board here. And I've done some modifications. I've upgraded the design, and I haven't really seen a design like this. This can be scaled up, just to give you an idea. So it's basically a board with a fence, and I've added the hold downs to keep the boards from shifting back and forth when you're pulling your plane back. And the stops are just a series of screws that you can adjust in height and back off into they're countersunk so they don't interfere with the plane. And one of the modifications I've made is the fact that I can plug it into my workbench. So it plugs right into my workbench. You'd have to adapt it to your own workbench if you design something like this. So it plugs into the standard dog holes, and that's nice. I was originally using Holdfast, but I found them cumbersome to use. And as with most of my other workbench appliances or workbench jigs, I've added the functionality of plugging it into the workbench. Now I've also added this other functionality of a system to hold the works down, and I'll just give an example. So if I had this piece in here, I could hold it down. So it's graduated. I can hold down boards as thin as 3/4 inch thick, which is fairly standard, up to 1.5 inches. And when I do the 1.5 inches, I have a predetermined spacer for that, and I'll show more detail of that. So that plugs in, and that allows me to work with anything 1.5 inch thick. So that would be an example of 1.5 inches there. So that's both 2 3/4 inch boards, so that can clamp that down. So it's very versatile, and I can also clamp boards 1 inch thick or something. But the standard size I'll be working with is 3/4 inch thick. Some without the spacer for now. I'll just put the spacers here. Let's flip this around. So it's actually slotted, so it moves back and forth. There's a threaded metal insert, and I'll just show that. Metal insert on both for wear, to keep from wearing out the, I could use wooden threads, but I prefer this. And I've had to raise it a little. And I also added just a little more functionality with some added, just a little strip of sandpaper glued on. So what this does is it keeps the, here I'll just give an example. I'll just lock it in. So what this does is it keeps the board from rotating. Now, you'll find that most sticking boards don't have this functionality. So it works, it also works, but I found when I'm pulling the plane back, sometimes it pulls it away. So most sticking boards have the base and the fence is supposed to keep the board tightly against it because you're actually working against the fence. But I find when you're pulling the hand plane back, it tends to pull the board away from the fence each time. It's just the nature of hand planing. So just to avoid that, and it slows everything down considerably because you have to reset the board against the fence and the stops, the adjustable stops. So I just decided to add this functionality in where I can. Now if you notice I have two, and this is because sometimes depending on the grain orientation, I might actually be creating the profile in a different direction. So I might have the board at this end and planing at this in this direction for some operations or for all operations, and it's symmetric. It has the stops, the adjustable stops on each end, and I'll just show that again. It has the stops, adjustable stops on each end. Now I've only this is only about 32 inches long, but again it's scalable, so you should be able to make one up to 48 or 60 inches depending on the type of work you do. So I can probably get two different moldings out of this for a piece of furniture, a small piece of furniture, and then back it off and create another one using, and I'll give a demonstration of what I do to make the molding similar. I develop a template system, so I create a template from the molding. So again, this is really for demonstration purposes. This side it works, but you should really make possibly a longer one, a 36, and I might just do that soon, or a 48. But at the moment I'm only working with boards of this size as I'm developing the techniques and on how to do this successfully. So I'm also striving to introduce repeatability into creating these, because let's not forget they need to be uniform on a piece of furniture. All the different moldings, all the profiles similar to each other. It's important to have all the moldings similar to each other as it wraps around the piece of furniture, or however you're using it, even on a picture frame, for example. So it's important to accomplish that successfully. So I've created a bunch of templates, and here's some templates of what I've done so far. These are small templates. These are the OG templates, and this is a rough approximation in a 1-inch board of all the little steps involved in creating the profile. And this is the profile I'll be using in the next two episodes on how to create both a cove and a round or an ovalo. I'll just slice this off the end of the board, actually, this board. And this provides me the template to be able to reproduce that with the two fillets on each one of these. Again, this it really depends on the profile really depends on the type of plane you have. So in this case, this number 6 is ideal for this profile that I've created. But you could go up to number 8, which is a 1/2 inch. It works in 8 would correspond to 8/16. 1/16 per number, so 8/16 is a 1/2 inch, and this is about 3/8, or sorry, this is a 1/2 inch, and then there's up to 5/8 and maybe 6/8 is 3/4, and after that it becomes more of an architectural type molding. So going back to this hollow that I used the most often so far, one of my 2 hollows, this is between 5/8 and 3/4 of an inch, so I'd say this is a number 10. This would correspond to a number 10 possibly. This is a little wider. This is definitely a little bit over 3/4, so that's at least a number 12. And the hollow, the round is, we're just working with, it's a 1/2 inch, so that's number 8. So ideally you should have a series of number 4s, and they work in pairs too. You can get pairs or you can get dissimilar ones. 4, a 6 and an 8 are ideal sets to have to create most of the profiles you'll need if you're doing individual profiles, and also if you're doing the more complex OG type profiles. So this is symmetric and it's just the same board. I created a OG on both sides. I also want to discuss grain orientation is critical when you're working with this, because you want grain to be rising in both directions. So again, grain orientation is critical, and you need grain rising both along the face and along the edge. Ideally, you could work against the grain a little bit if necessary, but so on each board there is one intersection of a face and an edge where the grain rises in both directions. So I've selected that now. So this rises in this direction and rises in this direction. So I'll be planing the profile in this corner on this side. And I'll get close up and demonstrate that process or that technique, because the profile itself will very much resemble this profile, and I'll actually demonstrate how I arrive at this with the two fillets at top and bottom and the actual cove from this size, a 3/4 inch board. This is again, it's a 3/4 inch thick board, and it's a standard 2.5 inch. So I prepared these boards. I have a series of them. They're fairly inexpensive boards, so I can use them for testing purposes. And I'll be using the sticking board here. The first step would be to lay out profile again. So I'll just switch the camera around so we can get a better view of that. So please subscribe to my YouTube woodworking channel, where I share more of my woodworking techniques, my woodworking philosophy, my thoughts on woodworking, and all the challenges I've experienced, and I introduce some of the new forms of woodworking I've discovered. And also visit woodskills.com, where I have a good selection of my books, both in print and digital format, on woodworking, and all my online courses, and I also offer some woodworking plans. I have maintained a regular blog on what I've got going on in my workshop and in woodworking in general. So enjoy.